A cruel farmer, driven by greed, abandons a sick Mustang deep in the mountains, leaving it tied to an ancient oak tree as wolf howls echo through the darkness. The horse, once proud and strong, now stands weak and trembling, awaiting its fate. But just as the hungry pack closes in, something extraordinary happens, something that will change both human and horse forever. Stay with us for an unforgettable tale of survival, redemption, and the powerful bond that can form between the most unexpected souls. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The harsh winter wind howled through the Colorado Rockies, painting the vast wilderness in shades of steel, gray and bitter white. Snow had begun to fall, each flake a tiny dagger in the biting December air. Among the towering pines and weathered cliffs, a scene of quiet cruelty unfolded. A magnificent Mustang, its once gleaming black coat now dull and matted, stood trembling beside an ancient oak tree, its head hanging low in defeat. Marcus Fletcher, a tall man with cold eyes and calloused hands, worked methodically to secure the thick rope around the tree. His breath came out in angry clouds as he yanked the knot tight, ignoring the horse's weak attempt to pull away. The Mustang, which he'd named Shadow for its dark coat, had once been the pride of his ranch until sickness had rendered it useless in his eyes. "Can't feed a horse that can't work," he muttered, his voice as sharp as the winter air. "And I sure ain't paying vet bills for a wild thing like you." The horse's large brown eyes, glazed with fever, followed his movements. There was no fight left in the animal that had once bucked off every ranch hand who dared to mount it. Fletcher had found the Mustang 6 months ago, running free with a wild herd near his property. It had taken weeks to catch him and months more to break his spirit. But just as the horse had begun to accept the saddle, a mysterious illness had taken hold. The proud stallion had grown weak, its breathing labored, its movements sluggish. For 2 weeks, Fletcher had watched his investment waste away, refusing to spend money on what he saw as a lost cause. The distant howl of wolves echoed through the canyon, causing Shadow to flinch. Fletcher smiled grimly, adjusting his worn leather gloves. "At least you'll be useful to something," he said, patting the horse's neck with mock affection. "Circle of life and all that." The Mustang's ribs protruded sharply beneath its hide, each breath a visible struggle in the frigid air. Its legs trembled with the effort of standing, hooves buried in the gathering snow. The rope around its neck was cruel insurance against any last-minute surge of survival instinct. Not that the horse had the strength to run anymore. Fletcher stepped back, surveying his work with cold satisfaction. The location was perfect, far enough from any trails or roads that no one would stumble upon the scene, but close enough to known wolf territories that nature would take its course quickly. He checked his watch, an expensive piece that seemed out of place against his rough work clothes. The sun was setting fast, and he needed to get back to his truck before the storm picked up. "So long, Shadow," he said, turning away. "You were a bad investment from the start." His boots crunched in the snow as he walked away, never looking back at the creature he was condemning to death. The horse watched him go, offering no sound of protest, no plea for mercy. Only its eyes, still bright despite its illness, reflected, the last rays of sunlight filtering through the trees. As darkness began to creep through the forest, the wolf howls grew closer. Shadow's ears twitched at each sound, but he barely had the strength to lift his head. The snow fell harder now, collecting on his back and mane, each flake another small weight on his weakened body. The ancient oak tree creaked in the wind, its bare branches casting skeletal shadows in the fading light. The first wolf appeared as a shadow among shadows, its yellow eyes gleaming in the gathering dark. A second emerged to its left, then a third on the right. They moved with the confidence of hunters who knew their prey was trapped. Shadow's nostrils flared at their scent, but even fear couldn't summon the strength he needed to fight or flee. The pack began to close in, their growls low and hungry in the winter air. The lead wolf, a massive grey creature with battle-scarred ears, crouched low, preparing to strike. Shadow closed his eyes, his proud spirit finally accepting the end that awaited him. But fate, it seemed, had other plans for the abandoned Mustang. Just as the wolves tensed for their attack, a sharp crack echoed through the canyon, a sound that would change everything. The sharp crack shattered the winter silence like breaking ice, sending the wolves scattering back into the shadows. Through the swirling snow, a figure emerged, silhouetted against the darkening sky. Michael Reeves moved with the careful precision of a man who had learned to navigate both war zones and wilderness, his rifle held steady in scarred hands. 20 years in the Marine Corps had taught him to read situations quickly, and what he saw now made his jaw clench with quiet rage. The tracks in the snow told a story he'd seen too many times since moving to these mountains. Another case of human cruelty masked as practicality. The horse's condition, the carefully tied rope, the chosen location, none of this was accidental. The wolves, momentarily startled by his warning shot, began to regroup at the edge of the small clearing, their yellow eyes glowing with predatory patience. Michael approached slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and calm. The Mustang watched him through fever-glazed eyes, too weak to even flinch away from another human presence. Up close, the horse's condition was even worse than it had appeared from a distance. Its black coat was dull and matted, ribs clearly visible beneath the skin. But what caught Michael's attention was the proud arch of the horse's neck, still evident despite its weakness, and the intelligent awareness in its dark eyes. "Easy there, warrior," Michael murmured, his voice gentle but firm. "Let's get you out of this mess." The wolves growled from the tree line, and Michael turned slightly, firing another warning shot into the air. The pack retreated further, but he knew they wouldn't give up easily. Not with such vulnerable prey at stake. Years of treating wounded. Comrades in combat had taught Michael to assess situations rapidly. The horse was sick, yes, but not beyond saving. The real challenge would be getting it back to his cabin before the storm worsened, or the wolves grew bold enough to attack. The thick rope around the horse's neck had rubbed its skin raw, and Michael's anger deepened as he noticed the expensive quality of the rope. This wasn't some desperate farmer's last resort, but a deliberate act by someone who could afford to do better. "Some people forget what it means to be human," he said quietly, reaching slowly into his coat pocket for his knife. The Mustang tensed slightly at the movement, but remained still as Michael carefully began to cut through the rope. "But you and I, we know about survival, don't we?" The wind had picked up, driving the snow horizontally now, reducing visibility to just a few yards. The wolves' howls seemed to come from all directions, amplified by the canyon walls. Michael worked quickly but carefully, aware that every moment they remained exposed increased the danger. As the last strands of rope fell away, the horse swayed dangerously, its strength finally giving out. Michael caught his breath as the Mustang collapsed to its knees, then its side, landing heavily in the snow. For a moment, fear gripped him. Had he been too late? But no, he could see the horse's chest rising and falling, its breath shallow but steady. The wolves, sensing their prey's increased vulnerability, began to creep closer again. "Not today," Michael growled, firing one. More warning shot. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, momentarily drowning out the howling wind. He knew he had to act fast. The storm was worsening, and darkness was falling quickly. His cabin was nearly 2 miles away, and while he had supplies there to help the horse, getting it there would be the real challenge. 20 years of military service had taught Michael to always be prepared. He pulled a small emergency sled from his pack, a lightweight but sturdy piece of equipment he'd originally bought for hauling game. It wouldn't be ideal, but with some modification, it might work to transport the weakened horse. As he worked to secure the Mustang to the makeshift transport, Michael's mind drifted to another rescue, years ago in Afghanistan, when he'd improvised a way to move wounded Marines under heavy fire. "Different battlefield, same principles," he muttered, checking the straps. "Adapt and overcome." The wolves had formed a loose circle now, their hunger apparently overriding their caution. Michael could make out at least 6 pairs of eyes gleaming. In the gathering darkness, they were running out of time. With a grunt of effort, he positioned himself at the head of the sled, wrapped the lead rope around his waist, and began to pull. The Mustang lay still, either too weak to struggle, or somehow understanding that this strange human represented its only chance at survival. As they began their slow journey through the deepening snow, Michael could hear the wolves pacing them, just beyond the trees. The storm continued to intensify, but he kept moving, one step at a time, guided by years of experience and an unshakable determination that had seen him through countless battles. "Hang in there, warrior," he said over his shoulder, though whether he was addressing the horse or himself wasn't entirely clear. "The night's not over yet." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The journey through the storm-ravaged wilderness became a battle of wills against nature itself. Each step Michael took through the deepening snow felt like trudging through quicksand, his breaths coming in sharp bursts that crystallized in the freezing air. The makeshift sled carved a deep furrow behind them, and the Mustang's dark form remained motionless against the gathering white of the blizzard. The wolves kept pace through the trees, their shadowy forms weaving between the trunks like smoke. Michael could hear them moving parallel to his path, their occasional growls carrying over the howling wind. They were waiting for him to tire, for his strength to fail, for any sign of weakness they could exploit. But they would be waiting a long time. Michael had endured far worse in places most people couldn't find on a map. "Just like that night outside Kandahar," he muttered, adjusting the rope around his waist. "Except the snow's a lot deeper, and you're a hell of a lot heavier than Rodriguez was." The memory of carrying his wounded squadmate through enemy territory flashed through his mind, bringing with it the familiar mix of pain and determination that had defined so much of his life. The storm intensified, the wind driving sheets of snow horizontally across their path. Visibility dropped to mere feet, forcing Michael to navigate largely by instinct and his intimate knowledge of the terrain. He'd spent the 3 years since, leaving the Marines learning every ridge and valley of these mountains, finding in their solitude a peace that had eluded him elsewhere. The Mustang stirred suddenly, letting out a weak whimper that was almost lost in the wind. Michael paused, turning back to check on his charge. The horse's breathing had grown more labored, its sides heaving with each shallow breath. The fever that burned through its body had melted the snow around it on the sled, creating a stark contrast against the white landscape. "Stay with me," Michael urged, his voice firm but gentle. "We're not giving up now." He reached into his pack, pulling out an emergency blanket he'd carried through 3 tours of duty. The metallic surface crackled as he carefully draped it over the horse's trembling form. It wasn't much, but it might help retain some of the animal's body heat. The wolves had grown bolder as darkness settled fully over the mountain. Their eyes gleamed like dozens of amber flames through the swirling snow, closing in tighter with each passing moment. Michael knew they were running out of time. His cabin was still nearly a mile away, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. A particularly aggressive wolf, larger than the others, darted forward suddenly, testing their defenses. Michael swung his rifle around smoothly, the motion ingrained by years of training. The warning shot kicked up snow near the wolf's paws, sending it leaping back into the shadows. But the message was clear. The pack was done waiting. "You want to dance? Michael growled, his military training taking over as he assessed the tactical situation. "Let's dance." He unslung his pack, quickly retrieving the emergency flares. He always carried. The wolves might be hungry, but they still had a healthy fear of fire. The first flare ignited with a sharp hiss, its red light painting the snow-filled air in crimson hues. Michael threw it in a wide arc, creating a temporary barrier between them and the most aggressive wolves. The pack retreated, startled by the sudden burst of light and heat, but he knew the reprieve would be brief. The Mustang lifted its head slightly at the commotion, its dark eyes reflecting the flare's glow. For a moment, Michael saw something in those eyes, not just pain or fear, but a spark of the same determination that had driven him through his darkest moments. This horse wasn't ready to die, not yet. "That's right, warrior," he said, his voice carrying the same tone he'd used to encourage wounded comrades. "You fight. You keep fighting." He lit another flare, using it to ward off a wolf that had tried to circle behind them. The snow seemed to absorb the light, creating an eerie dome of visibility in the storm. The wind had shifted, driving the snow into their faces with renewed fury. Michael squinted against the onslaught, grateful for the military-grade winter. Gear he still maintained out of habit. His muscles burned from the effort of pulling the sled, but he pushed the discomfort aside with practiced discipline. Pain was just weakness leaving the body. An old Marine saying that had become something of a mantra over the years. Through the storm, a darker shape began to materialize, the first glimpse of his cabin. The sight gave him a surge of energy, but he forced himself to maintain a steady pace. The wolves sensed the change in him, their attacks becoming more frequent, more desperate. They knew their window of opportunity was closing. Michael lit his last flare, holding it like a torch as he continued forward. The wolves' eyes reflected the red light, creating a ring of floating embers in the darkness. The Mustang remained still on the sled, but its breathing had steadied, somewhat, as if it too sensed they were nearing safety. "Almost there," Michael said, though the words were whipped away by the wind. "Just hold on a little longer. That's an order, soldier." The cabin emerged from the storm like a ship through fog, its sturdy log walls and snow-laden roof a beacon of hope in the whiteout conditions. Michael's arms trembled with exhaustion as he pulled the sled the final yards, his breaths coming in ragged gasps that frosted instantly in the bitter air. The wolves had fallen back slightly, confused by the sudden appearance of human habitation, but their hungry growls still carried over the howling wind. "Home, sweet home," Michael muttered, maneuvering the sled toward the cabin's front door. The structure wasn't large, but it was built to withstand the mountain's worst. The covered porch offered their first real shelter from the relentless storm, and Michael took a moment to catch his breath, his hand resting on the rough-hewn door frame. The Mustang lay motionless on the sled, its black coat dusted with snow, despite the emergency blanket. Its breathing remained shallow, but there was a subtle change in its posture, a tensing of muscles, a slight lifting of its head. Even in its weakened state, the horse seemed to sense they'd reached some kind of sanctuary. Michael worked quickly to unlock the door, his fingers stiff with cold despite his insulated gloves. Inside, the cabin was dark and cold. He hadn't expected to be gone so long when he'd left for his daily patrol of the property. But years of military discipline meant everything was organized, every supply in its place. He could navigate this space blindfolded if needed. "First things first," he said, moving to light the pot-bellied stove that served as the cabin's heart. The kindling caught quickly, and soon a warm glow began to fill the small space. Michael turned his attention to the next challenge, getting the horse inside. The cabin's main room was sparse but spacious, with his bed and living area tucked into one corner, leaving enough open floor space to accommodate their unexpected guest. The Mustang was too weak to stand, let alone walk, but Michael had learned long ago that necessity was the mother of invention. Using the sled as a makeshift stretcher, he began the painstaking process of maneuvering the horse through the door. His muscles screamed in protest, but he ignored the pain, focusing instead on the methodical movements needed to complete the task. "Just like moving equipment under fire," he grunted, remembering similar moments from his service days, except the equipment didn't usually weigh half a ton. The horse remained remarkably calm during the process, as if understanding that resistance would only make things harder. Its dark eyes followed Michael's movements, alert despite its exhaustion. Once inside, Michael quickly closed the door against the storm, shutting out the wolves' frustrated howls. The wind still rattled the cabin's windows, but the solid walls held firm against nature's assault. The stove's heat was beginning to take the edge off the cold, creating a pocket of warmth in the wilderness. Michael moved with practiced efficiency, gathering supplies he'd accumulated over years of treating his own wounds and those of various injured animals he'd encountered. The cabin's shelves held an eclectic mix of modern medical supplies and traditional remedies he'd learned from the local Native American community. He'd found that sometimes the old ways worked better than anything modern medicine could offer. "Let's see what we're dealing with here," he murmured, kneeling beside the Mustang. The horse's fever burned hot against his palm as he checked its temperature. The animal's breathing was labored, but not desperate, and its pulse, while rapid, was steady. These were good signs. The horse was sick, but its will to live remained strong. Years of combat medicine had taught Michael to trust his instincts when treating the wounded. The Mustang's symptoms pointed to pneumonia, likely brought on by exposure and stress. The previous owner's neglect had weakened the horse's natural defenses, allowing the illness to take hold. But with proper care, there was hope for recovery. Michael began laying out his supplies: antibiotics from his emergency medical kit, herbal remedies for fever, clean bandages for the rope burns around the horse's neck. The Mustang watched him work, its gaze following each movement with an intelligence that spoke of its wild heritage. This wasn't some broken-down riding horse. This was a creature of the wilderness, temporarily brought low by human cruelty, but not yet defeated. "You're safe now," Michael said softly, preparing the first injection of antibiotics. "And I promise you this, you'll never be tied to a tree again." The horse's ear flicked at his voice, and for a moment their eyes met. In that gaze, Michael recognized something he'd seen countless times before, the look of a warrior who refused to quit, no matter the odds. Outside, the storm continued to rage, and the wolves' howls echoed through the darkness. But inside the cabin, a different battle was beginning, one that would test both man and horse in ways neither could have expected. As Michael settled in for what promised to be a long night, he couldn't help but smile slightly. Sometimes the greatest victories came from the most unexpected battles. "All right, partner," he said, rolling up his sleeves. "Let's get to work." Dawn crept over the mountains, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pale gold and rose. Inside the cabin, Michael hadn't slept, maintaining his vigil over the sick Mustang with the same unwavering focus he'd once given to wounded comrades. Through the night, he'd alternated between administering medications and using cool compresses to battle the horse's raging fever, all while monitoring its vital signs with practiced precision. The Mustang had drifted in and out of consciousness, its powerful body racked by occasional tremors. Each time the horse's breathing became too labored, Michael would massage its chest and neck, encouraging it to keep fighting. He'd seen too many good soldiers give up when their bodies wanted to quit, and he wasn't about to let this magnificent creature surrender to illness. "You've made it through the night," Michael said softly, checking the horse's temperature again. The fever hadn't broken, but it hadn't climbed higher either. A small victory, but he'd learned to appreciate those. The morning light filtering through the cabin's windows revealed more details about his patient's condition. The Mustang's black coat, though dull from illness, showed signs of unusual markings. A white star on its forehead, and one white sock, barely visible through the mud and neglect. Michael stood slowly, his joints protesting after hours of kneeling on the hard wooden floor. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and silence. The wolves had retreated with the dawn, but their tracks in the fresh snow around the cabin served as a reminder of how close they'd come to losing this battle. Moving to the stove, Michael added more wood to maintain the cabin's warmth. His own stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since the previous afternoon. But before he could see to his own needs, he needed to try getting some nutrients into the horse. He'd prepared a mixture of warm water, electrolytes, and herbs known for their healing properties. "All right, warrior," he said, returning to the Mustang's side with the bucket. "Time for your breakfast." The horse's ears flicked toward his voice, showing awareness despite its weakness. Michael positioned himself carefully, supporting the animal's head as he helped it drink. To his relief, the Mustang accepted the mixture readily, taking small but steady sips. As he worked, Michael's trained eye noticed other signs of the horse's previous life. There were old scars on its flanks, telling tales of fights or falls. The muscles beneath its skin, though weakened by illness, spoke of tremendous power and speed. This was no ordinary ranch horse. This was a creature born to run free, to challenge the wind itself. "Someone tried to break your spirit," he murmured, running a gentle hand along the horse's neck. "But they didn't quite manage it, did they?" The Mustang's eye, though glazed with fever, met his with that same unconquerable look he'd noticed the night before. In that moment, Michael made a decision that would change both their lives. If this horse survived, he would never attempt to break it. Some spirits weren't meant to be tamed, only partnered with. The morning progressed slowly as Michael settled into a routine of care. Every hour, he checked the horse's temperature and breathing, administered medications, and encouraged it to drink more of the electrolyte mixture. Between these tasks, he began treating the rope burns around the Mustang's neck, carefully cleaning the abraded skin and applying a healing salve he'd learned to make from native plants. "You know," he said as he worked, falling into the habit of talking to his patient as he'd once done with wounded Marines, "I've got a pretty good idea who did this to you." The tracks and rope had told him enough. There was only one rancher in the area who used that particular expensive brand, a man known for his quick temper and quicker trigger finger when it came to disposing of animals he deemed unprofitable. The thought stirred something dark in Michael's chest, a familiar anger he'd worked hard to control since leaving the service. But he pushed it aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. Revenge wouldn't help the horse heal. Justice could wait for another day. By mid-morning, the Mustang showed its first real sign of improvement, lifting its head on its own to look around the cabin. The movement was weak, but it represented a vital shift from passive survival to active awareness. Michael allowed himself a small smile as he prepared another dose of antibiotics. "That's it," he encouraged, seeing the horse's nostrils flare with interest at the sense of the cabin. "Stay curious, stay engaged. That's what keeps you alive." He'd seen it countless times in the field. The soldiers who survived were often the ones who maintained their awareness, who kept fighting to understand their surroundings, even when their bodies wanted to shut down. Outside, the winter sun climbed higher, making the snow-covered landscape glitter like diamonds. The world was quiet, save for the occasional crack of snow falling from laden branches. Inside the cabin, man and horse continued their battle against illness and exhaustion, each hour bringing small victories and new challenges. As Michael prepared for another long day of care, he couldn't help but feel that this rescue was about more than just saving a horse. Sometimes he knew the act of saving another could lead to unexpected healing for the rescuer as well. Through The window. Michael watched as the afternoon sun began its slow descent behind the snow-capped peaks. The Mustang's condition had stabilized, but the battle was far from over. Every few hours, another challenge would present itself. A spike in fever, labored breathing, or moments of restlessness that threatened to exhaust what little strength the horse had regained. The cabin had transformed into a makeshift field hospital, with supplies arranged in military precision around the horse's resting place. Empty medicine bottles, used bandages, and half-full buckets of water told the story of their ongoing struggle. Michael moved between these stations with practiced efficiency, his movements economical and purposeful. "You're quite the fighter," he said, noting how the Mustang's eyes tracked his movements across the room. The horse's fever had finally begun to break, leaving its coat damp with sweat, but its gaze clearer than before. Those eyes held a wisdom that Michael recognized, the kind that came from surviving things that should have killed you. As he prepared another mixture of herbs and antibiotics, Michael's thoughts drifted to his own recovery after his last tour. The physical wounds had healed quickly enough, but the other scars, the ones nobody could see, had driven him to seek solitude in these mountains. Here, among the towering pines and endless skies, he'd found a peace that had eluded him. Elsewhere, the Mustang shifted slightly, attempting to find a more comfortable position on its makeshift bed of blankets and straw. Michael moved quickly to assist, supporting the horse's neck as it adjusted. The movement revealed more of the animal's unique markings. The white star on its forehead seemed to glow in the fading light, like a beacon of hope in the darkness. "Easy does it," he murmured, helping the horse settle. "Small steps, remember? That's how we rebuild." The words echoed those of his own physical therapist, spoken years ago in a sterile hospital room. Recovery was always a journey of inches, not miles. A sharp knock at the cabin door startled them both. The Mustang's ears flattened against its head, and its muscles tensed beneath Michael's hand. Moving swiftly but calmly, he retrieved his rifle from its place by the door. Visitors were rare in these parts, especially after a storm, and experience had taught him to be cautious. "Who's there?" he called, positioning himself between the door and the horse. The answer came in a familiar voice, weathered by age and wisdom. "It's Sarah Two Rivers, Michael. Saw your smoke and figured you might need some help." Relief flooded through him as he opened the door to reveal the elderly Native American woman who'd become something of a mentor to him since his arrival in the mountains. Sarah's deep brown eyes took in the scene quickly, lingering on the horse before returning to Michael's face. "Looks like you've had an interesting night," she said, stepping inside and shrugging off her heavy coat. Sarah had been the one to teach Michael about local healing herbs and traditional medicine, sharing knowledge passed down through generations of her people. "Found him tied to a tree," Michael explained, securing the door against the cold. "Someone left him for the wolves." Sarah's expression hardened at his words, her wrinkled face showing a flash of anger before settling into its usual calm. "Some men have forgotten how to be human," she said, moving toward the Mustang with slow, deliberate steps. The horse watched her approach but showed no sign of fear. If anything, it seemed to relax slightly as she drew near. But others remember what humanity means. Sarah knelt beside the horse with a grace that belied her years, her hands hovering over its body without touching. Her people had lived in these mountains for countless generations, and their connection to the land and its creatures ran deep. Michael had learned to trust her insights, even when they seemed to come from something beyond ordinary understanding. "This one has a strong spirit," she said finally, reaching into her bag, "but even the strongest warriors need allies in their battles." She began pulling out small pouches of herbs and minerals, arranging them with careful precision. Michael watched as she worked, mixing ingredients with practiced ease. The cabin filled with the sharp, clean scent of sage and other plants he couldn't identify. Sarah worked silently, her movements accompanied only by the soft sounds of the horse's breathing and the occasional pop from the wood stove. "Your paths have crossed for a reason," she said at last, looking up at Michael. "This horse was not meant to die in the snow, and you were not meant to stay alone in these mountains forever." Her words carried the weight of prophecy, though Michael knew she would deny any such power. The Mustang's eyes drifted between them, alert but peaceful, as if understanding the importance of this moment. Outside, the last rays of sunlight painted the snow-covered landscape in deep oranges and purples, signaling the approach of another long night in their journey toward healing. Sarah began to hum softly as she worked, an ancient melody that seemed to resonate with something deep in the cabin's atmosphere. Michael felt his own tension beginning to ease, and he noticed the Mustang's breathing becoming more regular, more relaxed. Sometimes he realized healing required more than just medicine and determination. It needed something older, something that spoke to the spirit as well as the body. The early evening settled over the cabin like a soft blanket, Sarah's healing ceremony having transformed the atmosphere from one of urgent care to peaceful recovery. The Mustang lay quiet but alert, its breathing steadier than it had been since Michael had first found it in the storm. The ancient herbs Sarah had burned still lingered in the air, their aromatic presence both calming and invigorating. "His fever is breaking," Sarah announced, her weathered hand resting lightly on the horse's neck. "But the real healing is just beginning." She reached into her medicine bag again, pulling out a small clay pot sealed with beeswax. The contents, she explained, were a poultice passed down through generations of her family, specifically for healing animals who had endured both physical and spiritual wounds. Michael watched as she carefully applied the mixture to the rope burns around the Mustang's neck. The horse remained still, seeming to understand that this strange-smelling substance was meant to help. "Animals know," Sarah said, as if reading his thoughts. "They can sense when someone truly means to heal them." As she worked, Sarah began sharing stories of her people's connection with horses, particularly the wild Mustangs that had roamed these mountains for centuries. "They are not just animals," she explained, her voice taking on the rhythmic quality of a practiced storyteller. "They are spirits of the wind and earth, choosing to walk among us in physical form." The Mustang's ears flicked forward at her. Words. Its dark eyes focused on her face, as if understanding every word. Michael noticed how the horse's posture had changed since Sarah's arrival. There was still weakness, but also a new kind of alertness, an engagement with its surroundings that hadn't been there before. "What do you see when you look at him?" Michael asked, curious about her deeper insights. Sarah was quiet for a moment, studying the Mustang with eyes that seemed to see beyond the physical. "I see a warrior who has never truly been defeated," she said finally. "The man who tied him to that tree thought he was breaking his spirit, but he only proved its strength." She gestured to the white star on the horse's forehead. "This marking, my grandmother would have called it a spirit mark. It shows that this one was born to be free." Michael thought about her words as he prepared fresh water and feed for the horse. The Mustang had begun showing interest in food again, another positive sign in its recovery. Sarah had brought special herbs to mix with the feed, explaining that they would help restore the horse's strength while continuing to fight the infection. "Your own spirit recognized his," Sarah continued, watching as Michael worked. "That's why you found him when you did. The ancestors guide such meetings." She smiled at Michael's skeptical expression. "You don't have to believe in the old ways for them to be true, young warrior." The conversation was interrupted by a sound from the horse, not the weak whimpers of before, but a soft nicker, almost like a greeting. Both humans turned to see the Mustang attempting to raise its head, showing more strength than it had since its rescue. Sarah nodded approvingly, reaching into her bag once more. "It's time," she said, pulling out a small bundle wrapped in red cloth. Inside was a braid of sweetgrass, another sacred herb used in healing ceremonies. "We need to cleanse the space of the fear and pain that followed you both here. The body cannot fully heal, while the spirit remembers only trauma." As she lit the sweetgrass, its sweet smoke joining the lingering scent of the previous herbs, Sarah began to sing softly in her native language. The melody seemed to fill the cabin, not just with sound, but with something more profound, a sense of connection to something ancient and powerful. Michael found himself relaxing despite his military-trained alertness, the tension of the past 24 hours beginning to ease from his shoulders. The Mustang, too, seemed affected by the ceremony, its breathing becoming deeper and more regular, its eyes half closed in what appeared to be peaceful rest rather than exhaustion. "Tomorrow," Sarah said as she finished her song, "we'll begin rebuilding his strength, but tonight is for healing deeper wounds, his and yours." She looked at Michael with knowing eyes. Sometimes the greatest medicine is simply knowing you're not fighting your battles alone. As if in response to her words, the Mustang shifted slightly, turning its head to better see them both. In the fading light, its white star seemed to glow, a beacon of hope in the gathering darkness. Outside, the wind had died down, leaving the mountain world in perfect silence. Sarah gathered her things slowly, preparing to leave. "I'll return at first light," she promised, pulling on her heavy coat. "Keep the sweetgrass burning through the night. It will help guide his dreams away from fear and toward healing." She paused at the door, looking back at man and horse with a gentle smile. "You were right to save him, Michael. Some spirits are too bright to be allowed to fade." After she left, Michael settled into his chair near the Mustang, the sweet smoke curling through the air between them. The horse's eyes met his, and in that moment he felt the truth of Sarah's words about their connected paths. Sometimes the greatest healings came disguised as chance encounters in the snow. The next morning dawned clear and bright, sunlight streaming through the cabin's frost-covered windows to create dancing patterns on the wooden floor. Michael had dozed intermittently through the night, always keeping one ear tuned to the Mustang's breathing. The sweetgrass had burned until dawn, its sacred smoke seeming to hold the darkness at bay. The horse was awake before him, its head raised with newfound strength as it surveyed its surroundings. The fever had broken completely during the night, leaving the Mustang's coat damp but its eyes clear and alert. When Michael approached with fresh water, the horse nickered softly, a sound that seemed to carry recognition rather than fear. "Good morning to you too, warrior," Michael said, noting how the horse tracked his movements with steady awareness. The rope burns around its neck were already showing signs of healing, the angry red marks fading under the influence of Sarah's poultice. Even its breathing had improved dramatically, no longer labored but deep and regular. Sarah arrived as promised, just as the sun cleared the mountain peaks. She carried a larger bag today, filled with fresh herbs and what she called strengthening medicines. Her face broke into a wide smile when she saw the Mustang's improved condition. "The spirits worked strongly last night," she said, kneeling beside the horse to check its wounds. The Mustang allowed her examination without protest, seeming to sense her healing intentions. Now comes the harder part, helping him find his strength again. Michael understood what she meant. In his military days, he'd seen how the recovery period often proved more challenging than the initial survival. It was one thing to live through a crisis, another entirely to rebuild what was lost. "We'll start with getting him on his feet," Sarah explained, pulling various items from her bag. "But first, he needs a name. A true name, not whatever that rancher called him." She looked at the horse thoughtfully, taking in its coal-black coat and the distinctive white star on its forehead. "In my language, we would call him Wikasa." "Wakan," "Sacred spirit," she said, her voice carrying a note of reverence, "but perhaps something simpler for everyday use." She smiled as the horse's ears pricked forward at her words. "What do you see when you look at him, Michael?" Michael studied the Mustang, remembering how it had looked in that first moment, proud even in its weakness, defiant even in the face of death. The white star on its forehead caught the morning light, blazing against the dark coat like. "Now, Phoenix," he said suddenly, the name coming to him unbidden, "like the sacred bird that rises from the ashes." Sarah nodded approvingly, reaching out to touch the star marking. "A good name," she agreed. "A powerful name for one who has returned from the edge of death." The horse, Phoenix, seemed to respond to the name, its ears focusing forward with interest. They spent the next hour preparing for Phoenix's first attempt to stand. Sarah mixed a strengthening tonic of herbs and minerals, which the horse drank readily from Michael's cupped hands. The morning sun continued to climb, filling the cabin, with golden light that seemed to energize them all. "Remember," Sarah cautioned, as they positioned themselves on either side of Phoenix, "we are not here to force him up. We are here to support him when he chooses to rise." She began humming softly, the same melody from the previous night, as they waited for the horse to make its move. Phoenix lay still for several minutes, gathering its strength. Then, with a sudden determination that reminded Michael of a soldier answering roll call, the Mustang began to move. First came the front legs, powerful shoulders bunching with effort as Phoenix pulled them under his body. The back legs followed, though with more uncertainty. "Easy now," Michael murmured, his hands ready to support but not interfere. "Take your time." Phoenix's muscles trembled with effort, but there was no hesitation in his movements. With a grace that belied his recent illness, the horse pushed himself up, swaying slightly, but maintaining his balance. Sarah's humming grew stronger as Phoenix found his feet, the ancient melody seeming to lend strength to the horse's legs. For a moment, the Mustang stood perfectly still, as if remembering what it felt like to be upright. Then he turned his head, first to Sarah, then to Michael, his dark eyes carrying a look of quiet triumph. "Welcome back, warrior," Michael said softly, resting a gentle hand on Phoenix's neck. The horse's muscles were tense but steady beneath his touch, no longer racked by fever or weakness. This was more than just a physical victory. It was a statement of survival, of defiance against those who had tried to destroy this magnificent creature's spirit. Outside, the morning had bloomed into full brightness, the snow-covered landscape glittering like countless diamonds under the winter sun. Inside the cabin, man and horse stood together, supported by ancient wisdom and modern determination, each step of healing bringing them closer to an understanding that transcended their different natures. Sarah watched them both, her weathered face creased with a knowing smile. "The journey begins," she said simply, gathering her medicines, "but now he walks with friends beside him." The truth of her words hung in the air like the lingering scent of sweetgrass. Some paths were meant to be walked together, no matter how unlikely the partnership might seem. The days that followed fell into a rhythm as natural as the rising and setting of the sun. Each morning, Sarah would arrive with new medicines and wisdom, her presence bringing a sense of ancient knowledge to their modern healing efforts. Phoenix grew stronger by the day, his recovery exceeding even Michael's most optimistic expectations. "He needs to move more," Sarah announced on the fifth morning, watching as Phoenix paced the cabin's length with increasing confidence. "His muscles remember their strength, but his spirit needs to feel the wind again." She gestured toward the door, where bright sunlight streamed through the windows. "It's time for his first step outside." Michael understood the necessity, but concern creased his brow. The wolves hadn't been seen since that first night, but their tracks still appeared occasionally in the fresh snow around the cabin. More worrying were the other tracks he'd noticed, boot prints that didn't belong to either him or Sarah, suggesting that word of Phoenix's survival had reached unwanted ears. "We'll need to be careful," he said, checking his rifle out of habit. "There are those who wouldn't be happy to see him recovered." Sarah nodded, her dark eyes showing she understood more than just his spoken concerns. "The Earth herself will protect him now," she said, pulling a small pouch from her medicine bag. "But it doesn't hurt to have a warrior standing guard as well." She sprinkled some of the pouch's contents, a mixture of herbs and blessed tobacco, in a circle around the cabin's entrance, murmuring prayers in her native tongue. Phoenix watched their preparations with keen interest, his ears pricked forward and nostrils flaring as he caught scents of the outside world. The white star on his forehead seemed to gleam brighter in anticipation, like a beacon calling him back to the open sky. "All right, brother," Michael said softly, approaching the horse with a lead rope made of soft leather, nothing like the cruel rope that had once bound him. "Let's take this slow." Phoenix allowed him to attach the rope without flinching, their trust having grown stronger with each passing day. Sarah opened the door, letting in a burst of crisp mountain air. Phoenix's reaction was immediate. His head lifted higher, and a soft, nickering sound escaped him, almost like a greeting to the world he'd been separated from. Michael felt the surge of energy through the lead rope, but was impressed by the horse's restraint. Despite his obvious excitement, Phoenix waited for Michael's guidance. Together, they stepped out onto the cabin's porch. The winter sun hung high, in a crystal-clear sky, making the snow-covered landscape sparkle like a sea of diamonds. Phoenix paused at the threshold, taking in the panoramic view of the mountains that stretched endlessly in every direction. "He remembers," Sarah said softly, watching as the horse's nostrils flared, testing the wind. "The mountains are in his blood, just as they call to you, Michael." She was right. Michael had felt that same pull when he'd first come to these heights, seeking peace after the chaos of war. They descended the porch steps carefully, Phoenix's hooves crunching in the packed snow. The horse moved with growing confidence, though Michael could feel the occasional tremor of weakness through the lead rope. Recovery was a journey of small steps, as he well knew from his own experience. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, its cry echoing off the surrounding peaks. Phoenix's ears swiveled to track the sound, and for a moment he raised his head high, presenting a profile that showed exactly what he must have looked like before illness and cruelty had brought him low. Proud, powerful, untamed. "The hawk brings a message," Sarah remarked, her voice carrying the weight of generations of wisdom. "It speaks of freedom returned and strength renewed." As if in response to her words, Phoenix took several more steps forward, moving away from the cabins. Shelter with increasing purpose. They walked slowly around the clearing, Phoenix gaining confidence with each step. The horse seemed to be mapping his new surroundings, noting landmarks and possible escape routes, behavior that Michael recognized from his own military training. Even in recovery, survival instincts ran deep. "He's not just healing," Sarah observed, watching them complete their circuit. "He's planning. Like you, Michael, he understands that safety comes from knowing both your surroundings and yourself." She smiled knowingly. "Perhaps that's why the spirits brought you together." As they returned to the cabin's entrance, Phoenix surprised them both by stopping to paw at the snow, uncovering a patch of winter-dried grass beneath. The simple act of foraging, of providing for himself, seemed to energize him further. His movements became more assured, more natural. "Tomorrow, we'll go a little further," Michael said, giving Phoenix a gentle pat as they prepared to head back inside. "Build up your strength day by day." The horse nudged his shoulder in response, a gesture that spoke of growing trust and understanding between them. Sarah gathered her things, preparing to leave them to rest after their expedition. "Remember," she said, pausing at the trail that led down the mountain. Healing isn't just about the body. Every step he takes outside is a step away from fear and toward freedom. Michael watched her go, Phoenix standing quietly beside him. The winter sun had passed its peak, casting long shadows across the snow, but the day's victory remained clear. They had taken the first steps on a new path, one that would lead them both toward something neither had expected to find in these mountains. Partnership born of mutual respect and shared survival. The following days brought steady progress. As Phoenix's strength returned in greater measures, their morning walks became longer, venturing further from the cabin's protective embrace with each passing day. The Mustang's natural grace reasserted itself, his movements becoming more fluid, more confident, though Michael noticed how the horse remained hyper-aware of their surroundings, a survival instinct they both shared. One crisp morning, as they prepared for their daily exercise, Sarah arrived earlier than usual. Her expression carried a weight that Michael recognized immediately, the look of someone bearing difficult news. "There's trouble coming," she said without preamble, her dark eyes serious. Marcus Fletcher was in town yesterday, asking questions about a missing black horse. Michael's jaw tightened at the name. Fletcher's reputation for cruelty was well known in the area, though few dared to challenge him openly. "How much does he know?" he asked, unconsciously moving closer to Phoenix, who had tensed at the shift in atmosphere. "Enough to be dangerous," Sarah replied, setting down her medicine bag. "He's offering a reward for information. Claims the May horse was stolen from his property." She spat the last words with uncharacteristic bitterness. "Some men's lies come as naturally as breathing." Phoenix snorted softly, his ears pinned back at the tension in their voices. The horse's recovery had progressed remarkably, but Michael knew they weren't ready for a confrontation, not yet. The rope burns had healed, leaving pale scars beneath the dark coat, but the deeper wounds of trust and confidence were still mending. "We need to be ready," Michael said, his military training automatically kicking in as he assessed their situation. The cabin's isolated location was both blessing and curse, difficult to find, but also difficult to defend or escape from if discovered. "How much time do you think we have?" Sarah moved to Phoenix's side, running her weathered hands along his flanks with practiced care. "The snow works in our favor," she said. "The higher trails are still treacherous. Even Fletcher isn't fool enough to bring men up here until conditions improve." She paused, considering. "But when spring comes—" Michael nodded, understanding the unspoken warning. Spring wasn't far off. Already the days were lengthening, the sun carrying more warmth. Soon the snow would begin to melt, making the mountain paths accessible to those who wish them harm. "Then we use this time," he decided, reaching for Phoenix's lead rope. "We step up his training, build his strength faster." The horse's ears pricked forward at his voice, sensing the shift in energy. He needs to be ready, ready to run, ready to fight if necessary. Sarah watched as Michael led Phoenix out into the clearing, noting how the horse moved in perfect sync with his human companion. "He trusts you," she observed. "That's good. He'll need that trust in the days ahead." She began unpacking various herbs and medicines from her bag. "I brought something special today, medicines my grandmother used to prepare warriors for battle." Their training session that morning took on new intensity. Michael led Phoenix through increasingly complex movements, encouraging the horse to test his renewed strength. They worked on quick turns, sudden stops, and burst of speed, skills that might mean the difference between freedom and captivity. Phoenix responded to the challenge with remarkable intelligence, seeming to understand the urgency behind their exercises. His movements became sharper, more precise, the lingering weakness from his illness burning away in the face of necessity. The white star on his forehead gleamed with sweat as he executed another sharp turn at Michael's subtle signal. "He remembers who he is," Sarah said, watching them work. The illness and ropes may have weakened his body, but they couldn't touch his spirit. She began preparing a strengthening poultice, the pungent smell of herbs filling the crisp mountain. Yeah, but remember, Michael, a horse's greatest strength isn't in his muscles or his speed. It's in his heart, Michael finished, thinking of the courage Phoenix had shown even when tied to that tree, facing death. The horse nickered softly, bumping his shoulder as they paused for rest. The trust between them had grown into something profound. A partnership forged in survival and strengthened by shared purpose. As the sun climbed higher, they continued their preparations. Sarah taught Michael how to apply war paint in the traditional way of her people, explaining how certain symbols could offer protection and strength. Phoenix stood perfectly still as they marked the white star on his forehead with a mixture of red ochre and blessed herbs. "The star is his power point," Sarah explained, her fingers tracing the natural marking. "It shows where his spirit connects to the sky spirits. We honor it, make it stronger." The horse seemed to understand the significance of the ceremony, his dark eyes reflecting an ancient wisdom that transcended human understanding. Later, as they watched Phoenix grazing peacefully in the clearing, Michael voiced the question that had been weighing on his mind. What if Fletcher comes with the law on his side? He could claim legal ownership. Sarah's response carried the weight of generations of her people's experience with such matters. "Some laws are written on paper," she said, her voice firm. "Others are written in the earth and sky. Phoenix has chosen his path, chosen you as his ally. No man's paper can break that bond." The truth of her words hung in the air between them, as solid as the mountains themselves. Whatever came next, they would face it together, man, horse, and the ancient wisdom that had brought them to this point. The real battle lay ahead, but today they had begun to prepare, strengthening not just body and skill, but the deeper bonds that would see them through the coming storm. The sound of hooves on packed snow echoed through the crisp mountain air. As Michael and Phoenix completed another training circuit around the expanded clearing, 2 weeks had passed since Sarah's warning, and each day had brought noticeable improvement in the Mustang's strength and agility. The horse moved with fluid grace now, his black coat gleaming with health in the winter sunlight, the white star on his forehead still bearing traces of Sarah's protective markings. "Good boy," Michael praised, bringing Phoenix to a stop near the cabin. The horse's breathing was steady despite the workout, his muscles rippling with renewed power beneath his winter coat. Gone was the frightened, sickly creature Michael had found tied to a tree. In its place stood a warrior reborn, every bit as vigilant and determined as his human companion. Sarah watched from the cabin porch, her experienced eyes noting every detail of Phoenix's movement. "His spirit is almost fully awakened," she said, as Michael led the horse over. "But there's one more test he needs to face before he's ready." She reached into her medicine bag, pulling out a small bundle wrapped in red cloth. Michael recognized the ceremonial wrapping. Sarah only used it for items of special significance. "What kind of test?" he asked, though something in her expression told him he might already know the answer. "He needs to face his fear," she said simply, unwrapping the bundle to reveal a length of rope. Not the cruel type that had bound Phoenix before, but one woven from natural fibers and blessed with traditional medicines. The memory of the rope still haunts him. We can see it in the way he flinches when anything comes too close to his neck. Phoenix's ears flicked forward at the sight of the rope, his body tensing slightly though he didn't step away. Michael felt his own muscles tighten in response, remembering how they'd found the horse, bound and waiting for death. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, protective instinct flaring. Sarah nodded, her weathered face solemn. "A warrior must face his demons before he can truly be free of them. You know this, Michael." Her words struck home. His own recovery had required confronting painful memories, transforming them from sources of trauma into foundations of strength. The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow as they prepared for this newest challenge. Sarah burned sacred herbs, the smoke curling around them in the still air, while she sang softly in her native tongue. Phoenix stood quietly, his dark eyes reflecting an understanding that seemed beyond mere animal awareness. "Let him choose," Sarah instructed, handing the blessed rope to Michael. "Show him the rope, but let him decide whether to accept it. This must be his victory, not ours." She stepped back, continuing her soft chant as Michael slowly approached Phoenix. Michael held the rope where the horse could clearly see it, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "It's your choice, brother," he said softly. "No one's going to force you this time." Phoenix's nostrils flared as he caught the scent of the medicines worked into the rope's fibers. His ears swiveled forward, then back, then forward again as he processed this new challenge. For several long moments, horse and man stood in perfect stillness, the only movement the gentle drift of sacred smoke around them. Then, with a deliberation that brought tears to Sarah's eyes, Phoenix stretched out his neck, bringing it closer to the rope in Michael's hands. "That's it," Michael encouraged, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're in control now, always in control." With infinite gentleness, he brought the rope up, letting Phoenix feel its weight against his neck. The horse tensed but didn't pull. Away, his trust in Michael warring with instinctive fear. Sarah's chanting grew stronger as Phoenix fought his internal battle. The horse's breathing quickened, his muscles trembling with remembered trauma, but still he didn't retreat. Instead, he took a small step closer to Michael, pressing his forehead against the man's chest in a gesture of absolute trust. "Now we're seeing his true spirit," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion, "not just surviving, but choosing to overcome." She approached slowly, reaching out to place one hand on Phoenix's neck, while the other sprinkled blessed herbs over the rope. "The ancestors are watching, celebrating his courage." As if in response to her words, Phoenix lifted his head high, the white star on his forehead catching the sunlight like a beacon. The trembling in his muscles eased as he accepted the gentle pressure of the rope, transforming what had once been an instrument of cruelty into a symbol of partnership and trust. Michael felt the change in the horse, a subtle shift that went beyond physical tension into something deeper. This wasn't submission or resignation, but a conscious choice to face fear and move beyond it. In that moment, he recognized in Phoenix the same fighting spirit that had helped him through his own darkest moments after leaving the service. "The circle is complete," Sarah announced, stepping back to observe them both. "He has faced his fear and chosen trust instead. Now he is truly ready for whatever comes." She began gathering her medicines, her movements unhurried but purposeful. "The spirits say we'll need this strength soon. Change is coming with the spring winds." As if to emphasize her words, a cold breeze swept down from the higher peaks, carrying with it the first hints of winter's eventual retreat. Phoenix turned to face it, his nostrils flaring as he tested the air. The blessed rope rested easily against his neck now, transformed from a symbol of captivity into one of partnership. Freely chosen, spring arrived on the mountain with subtle signs at first. Patches of bare ground emerging from melting snow, the return of birdsong in the dawn hours, and streams swollen with snowmelt. Phoenix had grown stronger with each passing day, his recovery now complete enough that Michael sometimes found himself forgetting the desperate state in which he'd found the horse. The Mustang's true personality had emerged as his health returned, intelligent, proud, but also surprisingly gentle in his interactions with both Michael and Sarah. He would often stand guard while Sarah gathered her medicines, alerting them to any unusual sounds or movements in the surrounding forest. The bond between horse and humans had deepened into something that transcended ordinary understanding. "He's chosen to be a protector," Sarah observed one morning, watching as Phoenix patrolled the perimeter of the clearing, his movements displaying both grace and purpose. "Like you, Michael, a warrior's heart beats in his chest." The white star on his forehead still bore traces of her protective markings, renewed each week in quiet ceremonies that seemed to bring the horse a special kind of peace. Michael nodded, understanding what she meant. He'd seen the change in Phoenix, no longer just focused on his own survival, but actively watching over their small community. It reminded him of his days in the Marines, where protecting others had given him a sense of purpose beyond himself. Their peaceful morning routine was shattered by Phoenix's sudden alert stance, his ears pricked forward and nostrils flaring as he stared intently down the mountain trail. Sarah and Michael fell silent, years of experience teaching them to trust the horse's instincts. The sound reached them moments later, the distant rumble of vehicles approaching. "They're coming," Sarah said quietly, gathering her medicines with practiced efficiency. "Fletcher has finally decided to make his move." She turned to Michael, her dark eyes serious. "Remember what we discussed. Some battles are won by fighting, others by choosing the right moment to act." Michael was already moving, his military training taking over as he assessed their situation. The cabin sat on a natural rise, giving them a good view of the approaching threat, but also making them visible to those below. Phoenix had moved closer to them, his muscled body tense but controlled, awaiting guidance from his human companions. "Sarah, take the back trail," Michael instructed, checking his rifle more out of habit than intention to use it. "If things go wrong, we'll need someone who can speak for us in town." The old woman nodded, understanding the wisdom in his words. She paused only long enough to press something into Michael's hand, a small pouch of blessed herbs and warrior medicines. "The ancestors ride with you both," she said, touching first Michael's forehead, then Phoenix's star marking. "Trust in each other and in the path that brought you together." With remarkable speed for her age, she disappeared into the forest, taking a hidden trail that led around the approaching vehicles. The rumbling grew louder, and soon Michael could make out 3 separate vehicles. Fletcher's distinctive black truck leading 2 others up the rough mountain road. Phoenix moved to stand beside him on the cabin's porch, their shoulders almost touching as they watched their adversaries approach. "Whatever happens," Michael said softly to the horse, "you make your own choice today. No one ties you down again." Phoenix nickered softly in response, bumping his head gently against Michael's shoulder in a gesture that had become their private sign of trust and understanding. The vehicles pulled into the clearing, gravel crunching under their tires as they fanned out in what Michael recognized as a tactical formation. Someone in that group had military experience. Fletcher emerged from his truck first, his expensive boots incongruous against the muddy spring ground. He was followed by 4 other men, including one wearing a sheriff's deputy uniform. "That's him," Fletcher called out, pointing at Phoenix. "That's my horse, just like I told you." He started forward, but stopped as Phoenix let out a warning snort, pawing the ground with one powerful hoof. The horse's message was clear. He was no longer the weak, sick creature that had been tied to a tree. "Mr. Reeves," the deputy stepped forward, his hand resting casually near his holster. "Mr. Fletcher here has filed a legal claim for that animal, says it was stolen from his property." He held up a paper that caught the morning light. "We have a warrant to search these premises and recover the horse." Michael stood his ground, feeling the quiet strength of Phoenix beside him. "The only crime here," he said clearly, his voice carrying across the clearing, "was when this horse was left to die, tied to a tree in the middle of winter." He met Fletcher's gaze steadily. "Or should we discuss the distinctive rope that was used, the same expensive brand you're known for using on your ranch?" Fletcher's face darkened with anger, but Michael caught the flicker of uncertainty in the deputy's expression. The law might be on Fletcher's side on paper, but the truth had a way of making itself felt. Phoenix stood proud and calm, his bearing a testament to the care and healing he'd received, a sharp contrast to the condition he'd been in when Michael found him. The tension in the clearing stretched like a bowstring pulled taut, waiting for the arrow of fate to fly. Whatever came next would determine not just Phoenix's future, but the triumph or failure of everything they'd worked for during these months of healing and rebuilding. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the muddy ground, as two very different kinds of warriors prepared to stand their ground. "Let me make this simple," Fletcher said, taking another step forward despite Phoenix's warning. "Stance. That's my property, and I've got the papers to prove it. You can either hand him over now, or we'll take him by force." The other men spread out, their intentions clear in their movements. Michael remained calm, his combat experience allowing him to assess the situation with tactical clarity. He could see that two of Fletcher's men carried rope lassos, while another held what looked like a tranquilizer gun, partly concealed behind his back. They had come prepared for resistance. "Before you take another step," Michael called out, his voice carrying the authority of his military years, "you should know that Sarah Two Rivers has already left to speak with the tribal council. They're very interested in hearing about how you treat animals on your land, Fletcher, especially since part of your ranch borders their protected territories." Fletcher's confident expression faltered slightly. The local tribal council held considerable influence in the region, and their lawyers had a reputation for being particularly thorough when investigating allegations of animal cruelty. The deputy shifted uncomfortably, clearly not having been told the full story. "This is private property," Michael continued, his hand resting lightly on Phoenix's neck, "and unless that warrant specifically mentions probable cause for animal cruelty, you might want to consider whether you're on the right side of this, deputy." The law enforcement officer paused, looking more carefully at the scene before him. Phoenix chose that moment to demonstrate just how far he'd come from the broken creature they'd found in the snow. With fluid grace, he stepped forward, his muscled form moving with the confident precision of a healthy, well-cared-for animal. The morning sun caught his coat, highlighting the glossy black fur that had replaced the dull, sickness-ravaged hide of months ago. "Look at him," Michael urged the deputy. "Really look. Does this look like an animal that was stolen or one that was rescued?" He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. "I have pictures from the day I found him. Would you like to see what Mr. Fletcher's property looked like when he tied it to a tree and left it for the wolves?" Fletcher's face contorted with rage. "Don't listen to his lies," he snarled, but the deputy held up a hand, his professional curiosity piqued. "I'd like to see those pictures," he said, his tone shifting from confrontational to investigative. As he moved forward to examine Michael's evidence, Phoenix remained alertly still, his intelligent eyes watching every movement in the clearing. The photos told their own story: the cruel rope, the emaciated condition, the obvious signs of neglect and illness. Michael had documented everything that first night, his military training prompting him to create a record. The deputy's expression grew increasingly grave as he swiped through the images. "Mr. Fletcher," he said finally, turning to face the rancher, "you didn't mention any of this when you filed your complaint." His hand had moved away from his weapon, a subtle but significant shift in body language. "In fact, you claimed the horse was in perfect health when it was allegedly stolen." "It's my horse," Fletcher insisted, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. "The brand proves it." He gestured to one of his men, who started forward with a set of papers. "Actually," came Sarah's voice from the edge of the clearing, "that's not entirely accurate. She had returned, accompanied by two men in business, suits who carried briefcases, tribal lawyers," Michael realized with an internal smile. Sarah had been busy. "We have documentation," one of the lawyers announced, showing that this horse was originally part of a protected herd that ranged on tribal lands. Any claim of ownership would have required proper registration with both state and tribal authorities. He pulled out a thick folder. "We've checked the records. No such registration exists." Fletcher's face had gone pale, his carefully constructed plan unraveling before his eyes. The deputy was now looking at him with open suspicion, clearly realizing he'd been manipulated into participating in something far more complicated than a simple property dispute. Phoenix chose that moment to demonstrate his true nature. With deliberate steps, he walked forward into the space between the two groups. His head was held high, the white star on his forehead seeming to glow with an inner light. There was no fear in his movement, no submission, only the quiet dignity of a creature who had reclaimed his own destiny. "The horse makes his own choice," Sarah said softly, but her words carried to every ear in the clearing, as he always should have been allowed to do. Phoenix turned in a graceful circle, surveying everyone present, before walking back to stand beside Michael. The message was unmistakable. The deputy cleared his throat. "Mr. Fletcher, I think we need to continue this discussion down at the station. There are some serious discrepancies here that need to be addressed." He turned to his radio, calling for additional units and animal welfare officers. Fletcher knew he was beaten, at least for now. With a last venomous glare at Michael and Phoenix, he turned and stormed back to his truck, his men following uncertainly behind him. The deputy remained behind to take formal statements, his earlier antagonism replaced by professional thoroughness. As the morning sun climbed higher, painting the clearing in bright spring light, Michael felt Phoenix relax beside him. They had faced their first test together and emerged stronger. Sarah approached them, her aged hands touching both man and horse in blessing. "The ancestors are pleased," she said simply. "Justice finds its own path when we have the courage to stand our ground." Phoenix nickered softly in agreement, his brave heart finally free to beat without fear. The days following Fletcher's failed attempt to reclaim Phoenix brought a new kind of peace to the mountain. Spring advanced rapidly, melting the last patches of snow and bringing fresh green growth to the forest floor. The tribal lawyers had moved swiftly, filing injunctions that would prevent Fletcher from making any further claims on Phoenix, while they investigated his ranch's practices regarding wild horses. Michael and Phoenix spent their mornings exploring the expanding network of trails around the cabin, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. The Mustang moved with the confident grace of a creature who knew his own power, his hooves sure on even the most challenging mountain paths. The white star on his forehead remained touched with Sarah's protective markings, though now they seemed more a symbol of triumph than protection. "He's ready," Sarah announced one particularly beautiful morning, watching as Phoenix navigated a tricky section of trail with perfect precision. Ready for the final step in his healing. Michael turned to her, somehow knowing what she meant. Even before she continued, "He needs to run free again, to choose his path without any constraints." The truth of her words resonated deep within Michael's chest. He'd known this day would come, had known it from the moment he'd first cut Phoenix free from that tree. The Mustang was a creature of the wild, born to run with the wind and dance with the mountains themselves. Keeping him tethered, even, with bonds of love and trust, would be its own kind of cruelty. "Today?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. The spring air was perfect, crisp and clear, carrying the scent of new growth and possibility. Phoenix stood nearby, his ears pricked forward, as if he understood the weight of the moment. Sarah nodded, reaching into her medicine bag. "The ancestors have spoken. This is the right time, the right place." She pulled out her sacred herbs. and began the ceremony that had become familiar over their months together. The smoke curled around them, carrying prayers and blessings into the mountain air. Phoenix remained perfectly still as Sarah painted fresh symbols around his star marking, his dark eyes reflecting a deep understanding. When she finished, she stepped back and began to sing. Not the healing songs of before, but something wilder, more ancient, a song of freedom and choice. Michael moved slowly, deliberately, as he removed the last pieces of human tack from Phoenix's proud form. Each piece represented a step toward complete freedom. The halter, the lead rope, everything that spoke of human control. The Mustang stood patiently, watching him with those intelligent eyes that had seen him through so many challenges. "The choice is yours now, brother," Michael said softly, stepping back to give Phoenix space. "Always has been, really." His voice carried all the emotion of their shared journey. The desperate rescue in the snow, the long nights of healing, the triumph over those who would have claimed ownership of such a free spirit. Sarah's song grew stronger, echoing off the mountain walls and seeming to call to something ancient and powerful in the air around them. Phoenix lifted his head, his nostrils flaring as he caught the scent of distant peaks and wild places. His muscles tensed beneath his gleaming coat, power and possibility trembling through his frame. For a long moment, the horse stood motionless, looking first at Michael, then at Sarah, then out toward the vast wilderness that stretched before them. The morning sun caught his star marking, making it shine like a beacon of hope and freedom. Then, with a grace that brought tears to Michael's eyes, Phoenix stepped forward and pressed his forehead against the man's chest, their gesture of trust and understanding. "Go on," Michael whispered, his hand giving one last gentle stroke to the horse's powerful neck. "Show us what freedom looks like." Phoenix stepped back, tossing his head as if in acknowledgement of everything they'd shared. Then, with a sudden burst of joyous energy, he wheeled and broke into a run. His hooves thundered against the earth. As he accelerated, his black mane and tail streaming behind him like banners of victory. Every stride spoke of power reclaimed. Every movement demonstrated the incredible resilience of his spirit. Sarah's song followed him as he ran, her voice carrying ancient prayers for protection and blessing. Michael watched in awe as Phoenix reached the crest of a nearby rise, his form silhouetted against the morning sky like something from a dream or legend. The horse paused there, turning to look back at them one last time. In that moment, with the sun behind him and his star marking blazing like a flame, Phoenix embodied everything wild and free in the world. He let out a mighty neigh that echoed through the mountains, not a cry of farewell, but a celebration of life and freedom. Reclaimed, then he was gone, disappearing over the ridge with the speed and grace that was his birthright. Michael felt tears on his cheeks, but didn't move to wipe them away. Some moments deserved to be felt completely, without any attempt to hide their impact. "The circle is complete," Sarah said softly, coming to stand beside him. "He came to you, broken, and leaves whole. There is no greater gift one warrior can give another." She touched Michael's arm gently. "But remember, freedom doesn't mean goodbye. Not when spirits are connected as yours are." Michael nodded, understanding the deeper truth in her words. They stood together watching the empty ridge where Phoenix had disappeared, the morning sun warming their faces and the spring wind carrying promises of new beginnings. The mountains seemed to cradle them in ancient wisdom, witnesses to yet another story of healing, freedom, and the unbreakable bonds that could form between the most unlikely of souls. The seasons turned like pages in an ancient book, spring flowing into summer, then autumn, and back to winter again. Michael continued his solitary life in the mountain cabin, but things had changed in subtle yet profound ways. The tribal council's investigation into Fletcher's practices had revealed widespread abuse, resulting in heavy fines and strict oversight of his ranch operations. More importantly, it had led to new protections for the wild horses that roamed these mountains. Sarah still visited regularly, bringing her medicines and wisdom, though now she often came with young apprentices eager to learn the old ways. The cabin had become a place of healing for more than just horses. Injured wildlife, abandoned pets, and even people sometimes found their way to this quiet sanctuary in the wilderness. "The ancestors are pleased," Sarah would say, watching. Michael tend to whatever creature needed help. One act of compassion creates ripples that touch many shores. The lessons learned during Phoenix's healing had transformed into a deeper understanding of what it meant to protect and nurture life in all its forms. But through all the changes, Michael never forgot the magnificent black horse with the star on his forehead. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of dawn or dusk, he would catch glimpses of a powerful figure moving through the distant trees. Phoenix hadn't disappeared entirely. He had simply claimed a different kind of relationship with the humans who had helped him reclaim his freedom. On this particular morning, exactly 1 year after Phoenix had run free, Michael stood on his cabin porch, watching the sunrise paint the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and rose. Sarah had arrived early, saying the ancestors had shown her it would be a special day. She worked quietly, burning her sacred herbs and singing softly in her native tongue. The sound reached them first, the thunder of hooves against the earth, powerful and purposeful. Then, like a shadow given form, Phoenix appeared at the edge of the clearing. He wasn't alone. Behind him, a small herd of wild horses moved with the same fluid grace that had become his trademark. At their center, protected by the group, ran a coal-black foal with a distinctive white star on its forehead. "He remembers," Sarah said softly, her weathered face creasing in a smile. "Remembers and chooses to share his freedom with others." The herd moved closer, showing none of the usual wariness wild horses displayed around human habitations. Phoenix led them with the confident air of a natural leader, his coat gleaming in the morning light. Michael stood perfectly still as Phoenix approached the cabin. The horse looked magnificent, even stronger and more powerful than when he'd run free months ago. The white star on his forehead seemed to shine with an inner light, still bearing traces of Sarah's protective markings that had somehow never fully faded. Phoenix stopped a few feet away, nickering softly in greeting. The sound carried all the complexity of their shared history. The desperate rescue, the long healing, the triumph over those who would have destroyed his spirit, and the ultimate gift of freedom, freely given and freely received. Behind him, the foal pranced nervously, its star marking a perfect echo of its father's. "You've been busy," Michael said quietly, smiling as Phoenix stretched out his neck in their old gesture of trust. The horse allowed Michael to touch his neck briefly, proving that while he had chosen freedom, he hadn't forgotten the bonds that had helped him reclaim it. Sarah began singing again, an ancient song of blessing that seemed to resonate with something deep in the earth itself. The wild herd moved closer, drawn by Phoenix's obvious trust and Sarah's spiritual connection to this land. For a brief, magical moment, the barriers between human and horse, domestic and wild, seemed to dissolve. "This is his true legacy," Sarah observed, watching as Phoenix moved back to stand protectively near the foal. Not just surviving, but thriving, not just healing, but becoming a protector of others. The wisdom of her words settled over the clearing like a gentle blanket of understanding. As the sun climbed higher, Phoenix gathered his herd with subtle movements learned in freedom. They began to move away, back toward the wild places that were their true home. The foal kicked up its heels, celebrating life with the pure joy only the very young can express. Phoenix paused at the edge of the clearing, looking back one last time. In that moment, Michael saw everything their journey had meant, the triumph of compassion over cruelty, of freedom over constraint, of love over fear. Phoenix had transformed from a dying creature tied to a tree into a symbol of everything wild and free in the world. But more than that, he had become a bridge between two worlds, proving that the greatest bonds were those chosen freely. The herd disappeared into the forest, the sound of their hooves fading into the morning stillness. But Michael knew this wasn't an ending. It was part of a continuing circle, a story of healing and freedom that would ripple outward to touch countless other lives. The ancestors say that some souls are meant to teach us, Sarah said, gathering her medicines as the morning light filled the clearing. Phoenix taught us that true strength lies not in breaking spirits, but in healing them. That true freedom comes not from the absence of bonds, but from the power to choose them. Michael nodded, understanding the deeper truth in her words. The mountain air carried the promise of new stories, new healings, new opportunities to stand against cruelty. And for compassion, Phoenix had shown them the way, and his legacy would continue in every life touched by the lessons learned during that desperate winter rescue and the healing that followed. The circle was complete, but the story lived on in the thunder of hooves, the flash of a star marking in the morning sun, and the enduring truth that some spirits were never meant to be broken, only set free to find their own path home. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.